Thank you for joining me today here on this episode of the Jeremiah Patterson Show. I was supposed to begin tonight with another topic, and we will get to that later in this show. But due to recent news events, I've decided to put this story here at front and center. All right, so last year, you will recall the death of a 26-year-old Black EMT worker named Breonna Taylor. She and her boyfriend were sleeping during the early morning hours of March 13th when they heard a loud noise at the door. Over time, it became unclear exactly what that noise was. Mr. Kenneth Walker, Breonna's boyfriend, called out and received no response. Breonna proceeded to go check the door and soon was shot to death. She didn't even make it to the door. By the time the police entered the apartment, Breonna was dead on the hallway floor after being shot 8 times. There was reportedly a no-knock search warrant at her home for drugs. And here's the backstory behind that. On March 12th, the day before, LMPD Detective Joshua James asked permission from a judge for no-knock search warrants. The judge then signed those permission slips, and then these 3 officers are off to go serve those search warrants. When they arrived at Taylor's home, they allegedly knocked several times, which does not make any sense, because if you have a no-knock search warrant for a narcotics investigation, you are supposed to do the opposite. You're not supposed to knock. And basically what a no-knock search warrant is, it basically allows law enforcement to enter your home without announcing themselves, typically in an effort to obtain evidence that can easily be destroyed or disposed of. That's according to the ACLU. But once they enter the home, then they have to announce themselves. According to neighbors, the police did not identify themselves. However, they allegedly knocked on the door and used explosives to enter the home. This was after they heard no response. USA Today reports, quote, Walker's attorney says when he and Taylor called out, there was no response. Kenny Walker got his gun as they came through the front door and he shot, end quote. Now, according to the attorney, Ben Crump, Kenny is a licensed gun owner. He is a registered gun owner in the state of Kentucky, and he used that gun. He used it to protect his castle, which is his apartment. He also used it to protect his girlfriend, Breonna, and also to protect himself. Additionally, Taylor's sister, Jania Palmer, was not present when the shooting happened. However, if she was there, she could have been killed. Quote, bullets went into the upstairs apartment and bullets went into the apartment 3. Nobody heard the police announce their presence. That was according to Robert Egert, which is Kenny Walker's attorney. This is where we get to the part where the firing blindly into the home transpires. USA Today writes, quote, the person shooting from outside the home could not see anything inside because the living room window was obscured by curtains and the second bedroom window was obscured by a screen and blinds, the suit claims. The officers involved were fired, arrests were made, subsequently criminal indictments were handed down, and ultimately one officer was found guilty by a grand jury of wanton endangerment. So Officer Brett Hankinson is being charged for not shooting into Taylor's apartment, but a nearby resident. In legal terms, wanton endangerment is putting someone or something in danger. In the state of Kentucky, where this shooting transpired, a person is culpable, meaning guilty of wanton endangerment in the first degree, if someone engages in behavior that causes the death or serious injury of another human being. According to federal investigators, officers Jonathan Mattingly and Miles Cosgrove fired the shots that ultimately led to Breonna Taylor's death, but they were not charged. Although they played a central role in the shooting, they were exonerated, and both officers were not formally charged. Kentucky State Attorney General and the special prosecutor for the investigation said both officers were, quote, justified in their use of force, end quote. Brett Hankinson, the officer who was found guilty of wanton endangerment by that Kentucky jury, is set to go on trial in February of 2022. It was supposed to be earlier, but it kept getting pushed back, and we think that is the official date. At least we're sure, maybe because of public reporting. Stu Matthews, the attorney representing Brett Hankinson, asked that the trial be moved to a different location, saying, quote, I think that there is subliminal pressure, if not direct pressure, of all those people in fear of what could happen should they sit on a jury and they could render a verdict that is not the verdict that a large segment of the population wants, end quote. Despite that urgent request, the judge denied it. Recently, Wave 3 News reported that one of the officers involved in the Breonna Taylor shooting is now under investigation for reportedly throwing slushies and other beverages at random pedestrians. The officer in question here is Kelly Hannah Goodlett. She was in charge of surveilling Kenneth Walker, Taylor's boyfriend, during that investigation. Mrs. Breonna Taylor's birthday recently passed, and the fight for racial justice continues. There is yet still hate as that fight continues. Recently, a mural of her was vandalized in Louisville, Kentucky, and it's under investigation by local law enforcement. They are seeking information on the matter. I will link that in the description of this episode and of this YouTube video. But the reason I started with Breonna Taylor here in this shooting is because of just a year later after her death, it appears a similar shooting has transpired. This is about a 49-year-old unarmed black man named Johhny Lorenzo Bolton, who was sleeping in his apartment, like Breonna Taylor, on the couch in Atlanta, Georgia. Police soon arrived with guns drawn, and they were to serve a no-knock search warrant for a narcotics investigation. Apparently, Mr. Bolton heard the knocking, stood up, and was shot twice in the chest by one of the officers conducting the search warrant. The shooting reportedly transpired in December, and initially law enforcement was not transparent with the family. Finally, as a last resort of litigation was essentially threatened, and this is now under investigation by the Georgia Bureau of Investigations. Mr. Bolton himself was reportedly not who they were looking for. The alleged drug dealer in question was just recently arrested. Daphne Bolton, the sister of Johhny, said in a statement, quote, "I want my brother's name to ring beside Breonna Taylor's. When they say Breonna Taylor, I want them to say Breonna Taylor and Johhny Lorenzo Bolton. I want them to be simultaneous." On April 14th of this year, an unarmed South African man named Lindani Myeni was shot and killed by police in Honolulu, Hawaii. This reportedly began when Mr. Myeni arrived at a house. He took off his shoes and entered the home. Apparently confused by the interaction, he quickly leaves and repeatedly apologized to the tourists who were in the home. This all took place at night, and a man and a woman, both reportedly a couple, were staying at this multi-unit home, according to lawyers. According to the doorbell footage, that's when Myeni arrived at the home wearing a face mask and was later seen with his phone and headband in his left hand. The woman inside the home called 911 and told a 911 operator that Myeni had no weapons in his hands. In the video, you can hear him repeatedly saying, "I'm sorry." The footage also shows him putting his shoes back on and getting ready to leave. As the couple was still on the phone, the man tells someone calmly that Myeni apologized and left. And then that's when the police arrived. The woman in the video is heard yelling, "That's him." An officer commands Myeni to get on the ground immediately, and he responds with a question, "Who are you?" I'm going to sort of explain that later on. Shortly after her husband was shot and killed, shortly after her husband was shot and killed, his wife filed a wrongful death lawsuit. And in that lawsuit, it states that Myeni most likely mistook the house as a regular community gathering center open to the public. In the video, Lindani Myeni is seen ignoring the officer's commands and appears to be confused. According to the family lawsuit, they said that Myeni would not have known the people shining the bright lights at him were officers. And if you watch that video, that's true. The officer didn't even identify himself. He just said, "Get on the ground now." I mean, just step back. Just think about this for a second, from like just a random person. If someone's yelling at you to get on the ground now, I mean, and they don't identify themselves as law enforcement, I mean, what are you supposed to do with that information? Reportedly, there are screams because Myeni then attacks the officer, but he does not know that is an officer, just this random guy yelling at him to get on the ground. So if you don't identify yourself, how are we supposed to know who you are? The officer then yelled, "Taser, taser, taser," and proceeded to tase Myeni. After that, you can hear a male voice yell, "Shoot him," upon which the officer deploys and fires his weapon. A male voice then says, "F you," we think he's talking to Myeni there, and the officer fires 3 more shots. Altogether, 4 shots were fired. If you would like to watch the full video of this unfolding, I will link that in the description of this episode. The full videos there, not only the doorbell footage, but also the footage of that horrific and tragic shooting. Mr. Myeni and his wife had just moved to Hawaii 3 months prior to the shooting, where she actually grew up, which would be the wife there. The couple believed that, unlike other U.S. states, Myeni and their 2 Black children would be safe from discrimination because of Hawaii's diversity. She has now filed a wrongful death lawsuit. This is Lindani Myeni, Mr. Myeni's wife, has now filed a wrongful death lawsuit, alleging that the officers were motivated by racial discrimination because her unarmed South African husband was Black. The now retired police chief in question here is Susan Ballard, and she claims that despite the widow's allegations of racism, the skin color was not a factor in this case. The mayor of Honolulu, Rich Blengardi, said in a statement that, quote, Mr. Myeni's death is tragic, end quote. The lawyer representing the Myeni family and the widow recently held a press conference on the shooting. This was just in late April.
He is a peaceful, law-abiding person with no criminal record, a father of 2, and now he's gone because HPD did not follow Hawaii law, did not follow its own procedures, and this was a wrongful death.
Still too many unanswered questions, and the family attorney's appeal for the release of the 911 tapes, the computer-assisted dispatch tapes, Myeni's cell phone, wedding ring, and the complete body cam footage from police, all falling on deaf ears.
They attacked him first. Why do I say that? Because if you shine a powerful light in someone's face and point a gun at them and tell them to get on the ground, and you don't tell them you're a police officer, that is an assault and a use of force in the law in Hawaii. And a use of force is never justified except by a police officer who announces himself and announces his purpose. That didn't happen here. So Mr. Myeni did not attack them. He defended himself from unknown assailants who were coming to get him with bright lights and a gun.
An angry Bickerton also dismissed the police narrative that this incident had nothing to do with race.
One of the things that we believe very strongly about this case is that if I had been in that mistaken position, if I had been there where someone didn't want me to be and the police came, that is exactly how they would have addressed me. But you can hear it in the tone of the officer addressing a Black man, treating him like he is nothing. Get on the ground. Not even worth being given the information that I am a police officer. It's outrageous. And I think we're all at risk.
As previously reported, they reiterated that the property where Mr. Myeni was killed was not a home, but a public accommodation that advertised its rooms on Instagram and Airbnb, with a temple situated right next door. That Mr. Myeni took off his shoes and went inside points to their theory that he might have confused the property for the temple.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Myeni's widow dismissed any notion that this was a burglary gone wrong.
They've been saying it's a burglary to a house, and I'm like, this whole story makes zero sense. Why would you burglarize on someone when you have money and when you have everything you need and you were just with your wife the whole day? You're gonna come with a 12-minute robbery or something? I felt like that was a very childish move by the police department to cover up whatever they're hiding. So anyway, I had spoke to him. That was at 7:52. I looked back on my call log. That was 7:52. I didn't find out till the next morning, but the police reports that I saw said 8:10. He was already dead with 4 bullets in him. So tell me how 18 minutes you just leave your husband and you just get off the phone with him and he's so close to your house. You're like 5 blocks from my house. You couldn't just, whatever reason he stopped by, you couldn't just let him go home. He was in his car. You approached him. Let him go home.
Honolulu police earlier said they viewed the shooting as justified and that the 3 officers involved who suffered injuries were fighting for their lives.
I saw the deputy chief say, "We are proud of these brave men." And I asked myself, really? Are you going to take this tape back to the academy and train another generation of police officers that this is how you make a stop? Get on the ground. Don't tell them you're a cop. Is that really what Hawaii is coming to? When we see this, do we have any wonder why this is the second shooting in a month? This is the mentality.
The SABC has requested an interview with the Honolulu Police Department, but has received no response to our request. Sherman Bricepies, SABC News, New York.
That reporting there was from April, to not confuse anyone about the releasing of body cam footage there. That body cam footage has now been released after public pleas and just a horrific situation there. And there are many questions here as for the conduct of the officers involved. Last week, the Honolulu Police Department pledged more public transparency, but we will see what happens. Civil rights activist and president of the National Action Network, Al Sharpton, said in a statement just last week, quote, Lindani Myeni's killing is yet another sensational racialization and criminalization of an innocent unarmed black man at the hands of police not following in the law and proper police procedures, end quote. On March 3rd, 2020, just weeks before George Floyd's death under the knee of a white Minneapolis police officer named Derek Chauvin, Manuel Ellis, a 33-year-old unarmed black man, was killed the same way. According to the Pierce County Medical Examiner, his death was a homicide and attributed to the lack of oxygen because he was being restrained. Witnesses allegedly saw Tacoma officers Christopher Burbank and Matthew Collins, both white, attack Ellis without speaking or provocation. And another officer by the name of Timothy Rankin is accused of putting pressure on Ellis's back as he continuously said that he couldn't breathe. According to witnesses, Ellis was not fighting back, and a home security camera captured his last words, which were, quote, "I can't breathe, sir." The officers involved in Mr. Ellis's death have since been put on paid leave and are currently under investigation. According to NPR, quote, the encounter began after officers reported seeing Ellis trying to get into occupied cars at a red light. They cast Ellis as the aggressor, saying he charged at an officer, exited a police car, but two witnesses who recorded parts of the fatal interaction came forward with identical stories, saying police attacked without provocation. An officer in the passenger side of a patrol car slammed his door into Ellis, knocking him down, and then jumped on him and started beating him, they said. Pierce County Sheriff Ed Troyer, who was at the time a detective and the spokesman for the sheriff's office, said then that none of the officers placed a knee on Ellis's neck or head. But one of the witness videos that later surfaced depicts that. In other words, it contradicts it. So that is not true. Reportedly, the Pierce County office just screwed up its initial investigation into Emmanuel Ellis's death because they failed to publicly release for literally 3 months that one of its deputies responded. And that's not supposed to happen. And independent investigations are required by state law. Subsequently, the Washington State Patrol and Attorney General in the state took over, and they are now conducting their own investigation with evidence obtained from the State Patrol. We know that Mr. Ellis was schizophrenic, but according to his landlords, he recently sought care and was doing better in recent months. And I know the burning question that many of you have right now: were any criminal charges filed, and what's changed? Well, let's take that first part of the question there about the criminal charges. Yes, criminal charges were filed. The Attorney General of Washington State, Bob Ferguson, announced late last month charges against 2 Tacoma police officers who were involved in this murder. One was charged with manslaughter and the other with murder in the death of Manuel Ellis. To be specific in legal terms, and also about the officers involved, Christopher Burbank and Matthew Collins have been charged with second-degree murder. And Timothy Rankin, reportedly the officer who put his knee on Mr. Ellis, whether it was his neck or anywhere near, he has been charged with first-degree manslaughter. Now, what has changed since this terrible situation occurred? Well, Governor Jay Inslee has formed a new task force to investigate police officers' use of deadly force. Also, Governor Inslee recently signed what NPR describes as, quote, one of the most ambitious packages of police accountability legislation. This legislation would completely ban police's use of chokeholds, neck restraints, and also no-knock warrants. This new law also makes it easier for officers to formally be decertified for egregious actions like this. So it's not like, hey, you committed this egregious action. Okay, well, I'm fired from this police department. So let me go to like North Carolina or let me go to like Idaho and go work for this police department. No, you're officially decertified. That egregious action that you did, it bars you from ever becoming a police officer again. So you can no longer hurt or put a citizen in that situation ever again. So NPR describing this legislation, this bill that Governor Jay Inslee signed into law as ambitious is sort of rightfully so. Of course, just months later after Mr. Ellis died in police custody, George Floyd died the same way. The person who recorded the deadly scene was then 17-year-old Darnella Frazier. She's now 18 years old. She testified in the Derek Chauvin trial about that day, and earlier this month, she won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, this is usually an award for journalists, but the committee officials who gave her this reward highlighted the, quote, crucial role of citizens in journalists' quest for truth and justice, end quote. Anne Marie Lipinski, a journalist herself, referred to this video as, quote, one of the most important civil rights documents in a generation, end quote. In another nationally prominent police shooting, 2 North Carolina police officers who fired shots at Andrew Brown Jr., which killed him, returned to work just about 3 weeks ago, and another is expected to resign at the end of this month. In Glenn County, Georgia, where Ahmad Arbery was killed by 2 white supposed neighborhood watchers, a black chief has just been named. His name is Jacques Batiste, and he said, quote, I promise you I will bring my best game every day, end quote. Since we're talking about the police department here, I do feel it's a need to sort of like go back to the history and understand like the deep roots here. When it comes to the police in the United States, it goes all the way back to the foundation of our nation. It became known as the watch system and was then named the Big Stick. It was basically set up as a new era where citizens could report emergencies. The city of Boston established their own watch system in 1636. Then New York and Philadelphia did the same thing. Apparently, these organizations were of no help when it came to stopping or limiting crime. According to nationaltriallawyers.org, watchmen commonly drank or slept on the job. Very soon after, more cities began creating their own watchman systems, and corruption and cruelty were conspicuous, where corruption and cruelty were just huge and just very obvious in those buildings, in those offices. Reportedly, some police officers accepted bribes, hustles, gambled, and even made away for master criminals such as robbers. They also illegally engaged in voter fraud by purchasing and stuffing ballot boxes. After the Civil War, the modern police department became more common. They were given uniforms and armed. Law enforcement in the Black community began having high tensions. Prior to this, they were reportedly slave patrols, which were in charge of keeping order. So you can tell that friction there, that those high tensions, you can sort of understand those high tensions with law enforcement, given the history there. When the Civil War ended, blacks and whites were already having high tensions. So when it came to the police, mainly consisting of white men, things just got horrific. The KKK and other domestic terrorist organizations formed and they targeted Black communities. They turned and they burned down Black churches, schools, and they participated in lynchings of Blacks. Some members of law enforcement were infiltrated by these groups and actually joined them, along with government officials. During the Civil Rights Movement, when Blacks decided to protest against segregation, racism, and other laws, the police was called in. because they had the temerity to voice their opposition and condemnation of these despicable actions. And those protests turned violent, not because of the blacks, but because of law enforcement, which used fire hoses, dogs, batons, and other forms of violence to silence that opposition. These consistent violent tendencies by law enforcement played a big role in pushing and ultimately passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. During a White House signing ceremony, President Lyndon B. Johnson delivered an influential and emotional speech. When Richard Nixon ran for president, it was on a law and order platform. And when he won, that agenda was implemented. In 1971, the administration launched a war on drugs. And instead of tackling drug issues, it led to the arrest and long prison sentences for blacks. So it was not really a war on drugs, more like a race baiting issue. Instead, Nixon's former domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, literally later confirmed that it was an effort designed to hurt black families. He told Harper's Magazine, quote, "We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news," end quote. In 1994, as U.S. cities saw crime skyrocket, a congressional proposal by the Clinton administration became law. It was called the 1994 Crime Bill, which led to the incarceration of many blacks and led to long life sentences for drug offenses. There were some positive outcomes from that bill, but that has since been seen as one of the most negative effects of it. In 1992, after a car chase of a 25-year-old black man named Rodney King, he complied with officers and he was brutally beaten. Many thought that would lead to a conviction, but it was just the complete opposite. There was no conviction there. It was a no guilty verdict. All officers were acquitted there. That verdict by the jury enraged many, and LA went up in flames. There were peaceful gatherings, but the violence is what mostly gained national attention. And more than 2 decades down the road, some things have changed, while a lot has remained the same. The police brutality is still happening, and accountability has been slow. But I will just say this one last thing here. We all know about the March on Washington and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech, right? About him saying that, "I hope one day that my kids will live in a world where there is equality and they will be judged not based on the color of their skin, but they will be judged based on the content of their character, for God's sake. Some change, some equitable change in the world." Well, if you've never fully watched the speech from Dr. King, you probably have not seen this part of the speech. You probably have not seen this footage. In this part of the speech that I'm about to show you, Dr. Martin Luther King is talking about police brutality. Just watch this. Just listen.
As we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied.
Once again, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking there about police brutality, words that are unfortunately still relevant 58 years later as the fight for racial justice continues. We have much more ahead tonight. Stay with us.